Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our course breakdown for this week's Worldwide Technologies Championship in Mayakoba. I'm not going to call it that anymore. We're just going to stick with Mayakoba Classic going forward. A little bit smoother off the tongue, but going to touch on everything you guys need to know for this week. Excited for the Mayakoba. It's the home of my first ever golf GPP win a little bit over 2 years ago. Won for 25 grand in the $5 150 max and haven't looked back since. Really started to take golf seriously after then, and now we've ended up at this point. So a lot of good vibes here. A golf course that I have a really solid read on outside of the GPP win, be more than 3x last year in our 150 max. So not going to tinker with the models too much, right? With what's worked over the last few years, we can go ahead and kind of copy and paste that strategy over to this year. So let's go ahead and touch on that strategy that's been also solid over the last 2 years. El Camaleon, one of the more unique and beautiful tracks that we have here on the PGA Tour in Playa del Carmen, Mexico. It's got a lot of variety to it, a lot of diversity with the holes. You have plenty that are along the coast, a few that are alongside mangrove forests and little marshes, and holes that are protected by dense jungles. So the winds change hole to hole. Some of them are protected from the winds. Some of them are exposed like you get with the coastal holes. And then with the mangrove forest, there's also plenty of little water hazards you can hit into, and a canal that comes into play on half of the holes too. So you're looking at a golf course that you kind of have to be an all-around player. But when you look at some of the metrics, right, it's a par 71. It's just over 7,000 yards. It's got paspalum from tee to green out there. So rough, fairways, and greens are all going to be that paspalum grass. You think this would be a relatively straightforward course. And the winning score here, sure, it's, been well under par, 15 to 20 under par, but you've got to have your ball striking. What differentiates this short track from some of the other hidden giggles that we have around the tour, like the 6,800-yard Port Royal last week, which, from a strategy standpoint, if the wind's not blowing, that course is just going to get eviscerated like you saw there. This course is a little bit more penal, especially off the tee. So when we're going to go hole by hole here in a second, you'll get an idea for just how narrow some of the landing areas are. But there's those marshy areas, that canal, those deeply wooded areas that are pretty much acting as a hazard of their own are going to come and play for some of the more inaccurate drivers. So this isn't quite the hidden giggle that we've seen for some of these fall event kind of events. You've got to have your ball striking around here. So it's no surprise that Viktor Hovland has won the last 2 years. And I've been on him heavily the last 2 years. When I won the GPP, he was kind of like a newcomer on tour, but was ball striking the heck out of it. And at that point, was actually hitting a lot of fairways. He's of late gotten a little bit more inaccurate off the tee, which is a trend that I don't love to see for Viktor Hovland. But this is the sort of course where you've got to keep it in play off the tee. The greens are extremely receptive, so the best iron players are going to have no problem hitting it to 5 to 10 feet all day. And also, you're dealing with flat greens. So while there's a lot of test from tee to green, on the greens, you're dealing with First off, slow greens. They're paspalum grass, which we'll touch on here in a second too. They're running at right around a 10 on the stint meter, and they don't have much undulation to them because it's more of a resort style course meant for players of all skill levels to play. So while from the tips, it's a difficult ball striking test, they have upwards of 5 tee boxes around Mayakoba here at El Camaleon, which means from some of the front tee boxes, you can take the bunkers out of play. There's no forced carries over hazards, that sort of thing. The angles into fairways are a lot less penal, that sort of thing. It's a great course to play, especially if you're somebody that's not a single-digit handicap. You can go out there and have a relatively good time. But even for these tour players, because of all the diversity of the holes, they have to account for different wind differences on the holes that are exposed compared to the holes that are being a little bit protected by that dense forest. It makes for a little bit of a conundrum. So I love it from that perspective. A Greg Norman design, not sure if I mentioned that before, which he tends to make ball striking sort of golf courses where you're trying to go out there and win with the best approach and off the tee play rather than your putting. You usually see easy to read greens with a Greg Norman design, and the paspalum grass is something we have to touch on before moving on here. It's a seaside sort of grass. My home course down here in Florida has paspalum. So, I've been pretty adamant about this in the past. They run extremely slow because they have to. It's a wide-bladed grass. It's a little bit more resistant to humidity and salinity in the air, which is why, down in South Florida, a Caribbean place like there at Mayakoba, you see it at the Puerto Rico Open, Corrales, those sort of tropical golf courses have to have this grass. And as a result, chipping is extremely straightforward. We'll get to that here in a second, but they're going to run extremely slow. So whether you're putting, you're chipping, it's not as difficult to take on shots that are down grain, that are downhill, that sort of thing. You're not going to have that much of a problem stopping the ball. But also when you're chipping the ball, because it's such a wide-bladed grass, you tend to get a little bit of a teed up effect, kind of like Zoysia, right? So you've heard the same sort of effect with Zoysia. I've kind of talked about it before because I've had a similar experience on Zoysia as to what I've had on Paspalum. But as somebody that plays on Paspalum more often than not down here in South Florida, I can tell you that around the green shots, you can hit a spinner from like 4 or 5 feet. I mean, I'm not kidding you. As long as you have enough acceleration at the bottom of your arc, you can hit spinners literally where you're only carrying them about like 4 or 5 yards on the side of the green. My brother does it all the time. I'm not as skilled around the green, so I have a little bit more trouble applying a lot of spin to the golf ball. My wedges also aren't quite as sharp on as new as some of my other buddies out there. You get the point that these guys aren't going to have any problem getting up and down. You're dealing with flat greens. They're running slow. You're going to get this teed up effect. Around the green at Mayakoba, it's mostly fairway, so you're not dealing with a lot of rough. If you get into any sort of a chipping hollow, you're going to be hitting out of a perfect lie. Just you're looking at off the tee accuracy, which you'll see here with the landing areas not being very wide, approach play, and that's about it, right? Around the greens, almost non-existent at a Paspalum golf course. But then the greens here are so benign that you also don't really differentiate yourself with the putter. Now, you've seen guys like Brendan Todd have a lot of lasting success here, have won here before. Victor Hovland did back-to-back the last 2 years. He's more of a putting specialist, but he's also extremely accurate off the tee. And when he's on his game, he's one of the better iron players in the field. So, he checks the other 2 boxes, and a lot of people before Victor Hovland won thought this was a little bit of a putting fest, and I think he's kind of dispelled that myth over the last 2 years, as his putting hasn't even been otherworldly en route to those wins. So just kind of wanted to talk about the skill set here before we talk about the key stats, but let's go hole by hole now. All right, we've got Pro Visualizer up, and let's get a taste for what these players are going to be faced with. So hole number 1, a little bit of a handshake, but not quite the handshake you see at some courses. 437 yards, par 4, with a little bit of a natural area to the left, a few shrubs, sandy areas, but to the right is what you have to worry about here. It's a dense jungle area where if you hit into it, you're going to have no chance of finding your ball, let alone trying to chip a shot out. Most players will be re-teeing or taking a lateral hazard drop. If there's a red line there, I'm not sure about that. I think there is a red line. I would assume so with a lot of these jungle areas where players can take a lateral hazard drop. But a few of them, depending on how far up the fairway you can hit it, may have to actually re-tee. So you really see the effect of these narrow landing areas. And even if you try to get it in the fairway, this is right about an 18-yard fairway right here. Now, it opens up to about 22 to 23 yards a little bit further up. If you lay up with an iron, sure, you're going to have a lot of distance in. I mean, like 180 yards if you lay up with an iron here. But you will see a few do that off the first tee, whether it's nerves, inexperience, just lack of confidence with their accuracy off the tee. You're going to get a huge idea for a player's confidence level there on the very first hole. So it's difficult. It's not quite the handshake we're used to seeing. And hole number 2 is much of the same. So you have an even denser jungle to the left side. So you remember the jungle on the right looked like it had a few areas of grass there. No, this is complete jungle to the left. You have zero chance of finding your golf ball. Another relatively narrow fairway there. The green is protected by a bunker to the left side. It's also rather cavernous. That's one thing I have to note about a Greg Norman design is his bunkering tends to be among the best on the PGA Tour schedule. They're about 10, 15 yards deep. A lot of the Aussies are players that have success out of them as they're used to that over there in Australia. But players that are a little bit less skilled out of the bunkers tend to have a little bit of trouble here, which is ironic given that somebody like Victor Hovland has had so much success over the last few years. But I think a lot of that also has to do with the greens running as slow as they are, as receptive as they are, without tons of undulation or downslopes to worry about. Maybe just that kind of counterbalances how deep the bunkers are. So that's something to note. Maybe sand saves isn't the worst idea because there are a lot of bunkers around this property. Well, number 3, a little bit more straightforward, only 389, but you're going to have no chance at trying to get it up there near the green. Most players are just going to take a 3-wood, head it out there to the wide part of this fairway, and it's one of the few easy birdie looks, right? Just be conservative off the tee. If you have to hit an iron to hit the short stuff, then do so. You're going to have at the very most a pitching wedge, most likely something that's a degreed wedge into this green, and you're looking at a birdie look. I mean, the hardest pin location I can think of here would be the back right pin location where you bring in that side bunker, most likely a little bit of slope going off the back, I would assume. Most of the greens here do run off into the chipping area. So you can see over here to the left, you've got one of those fairway chipping areas I was talking about. Over the back of the green, it looks like there's one there as well. I would imagine a lot of the slope is feeding into them, but again, this is a resort style course. This isn't Brookline. This isn't Southern Hills where designers are purposely trying to make it more difficult. This is a Greg Norman design where he's designing this for guests of Mayakoba, right? Not necessarily the PGA Tour. Hole 4 is only 117 yards. It's a par 3. It's a little bit of a joke. The only time this hole gets remotely difficult is if there's a huge wind coming off of the coastline there. Most of the time, the prevailing wind is coming in off the coast, so you will see this play a little bit longer than 117 yards most days, but if it is a low wind situation, you're going to see a ton of birdies at 4. Hole 5 is 552. Dogleg from right to left. This is a birdie look every single player should be able to reach into, at least if they can get it in the fairway. Some of the shorter hitters, if they get it in the bunker, may have to lay up, but at the very worst, you're looking at a wedge shot in and what should be a 10 to 15 foot birdie look at the very least, if not an eagle look. Hole 6 is 411 yards. It's a hard to hit fairway, but it's more wide open. The penalty area to the left isn't nearly as penal as most. You can see there's actually quite a bit of rough to the left side. And then to the right, you have a little bit of room too. So one of the easier tee shots, I expect a few players to be aggressive and hit driver there. And a lot of the tee shots up to this point, it's a lot of 3 woods and irons off the tee. Hole 7 is another par 5. One that's reachable, and 2 as long as you miss this fairway bunker. A lot of the longer players will have to challenge it too. So you can see a 300-yard drive gets you right there. It's only, 320 to get to that bunker. If you get into this bunker, it's called the cave bunker. You have no shot at getting to the green. So you'll have to probably hit a wedge out, leave yourself about 150 yards into the green. But if you can hit it up to the left side of that cave bunker or to the right side, the fairway does slope from the left side to the right side here. So the ideal miss for somebody like a Hovland, it was typically over here to the right side. You leave yourself a clear look at the green. So it's another scoreable look. At the very worst, probably going to be a wedge into the green. Hole 8 is 149 yards, another short par 3, straightforward, not really much to say there. It's not along the coastline. Hole 9 is 464 yards. It's the easiest tee shot on property, kind of similar to last hole. It's wide open off the tee to the left. You have all this room to miss. And then to the right, you have a bunker and another sandy area to stop your ball before it gets into that deep stuff. So I would expect a lot of players to be aggressive here on hole number 9 as well. Hole 10 is 198 yards, so it's the longest par 3 on property, but it's also wide open, doesn't have bunkers in front. To the left side, the bunker's not all that penal. So I expect there to be rated about an even par scoring average. Hole 11 is 362 yards. It is the shortest par 4 on property. Also a tee shot where you can get a little bit aggressive about it, but the more aggressive you are, the more penalty areas that come into play, right? So these trees to the left, they're 289 yards, which is in play for everybody with a 3-wood. To the right side, you're looking at a similar sort of distance, right? 292 yards. And driver, I mean, you can get really deep into there, right? 330s in the center of the stuff to the right. 330s in the center of the stuff to the left side too. Actually, 320, right, is into deep trouble there in the left. Most players are going to take the sensible approach here and most likely hit an iron off the tee. Something like 260, 270 if they're hitting a driving iron, and leave themselves 100 yards or less into the green. Hole 12 is 448. It's a tight driving hole. You do have, yet again, jungle to the left and right here, but if you can hit the short stuff, it's going to be a wedge at the very most. So you can see where driving accuracy would come in handy. If you're hitting fairways around this track, you're not going to have many clubs longer than, let's say, like a 6-7 iron. On the longer par 5s, sure, if you're going for them in 2, you might have to hit a hybrid, even a 3-wood into them. But for these par 4s or even the par 3s, right, 150, 110 yards, 198 yards is the longest par 3 that we've seen to this point. It's not that difficult on approach, right? And especially when they're receptive greens. And when the winds are low here, you're looking at just a really tough test off the tee and kind of a cupcake from there on in. Hole number 13 is 520. It is the shortest par 5 on property, reachable in 2 for sure by everybody, even if you hit it in the rough. And the tee shot here is also not that difficult. You have like a solid 15 to 20 yards in either direction to miss. The rough around here, even though it's past palm, isn't all that penal, which if you got a long past palm rough, like let's say it was like 3.5, 4 inches long, you'd be in deep trouble because it's so wide, it's so gnarly. It really grabs the club kind of like a Bermuda grass, actually even more so than a Bermuda grass, but it's going to be about 1.5, 2 inches. So even if you miss the fairway here, you're probably having to look at the green, and I would expect to see a lot of eagles. Next up, we've got hole 14. Hole 14, they've got to lay up in front of the water, so it'll be an iron off the tee for most of the players. Maybe a sliced off 3-wood, a little bit like 3/4 3-wood off the tee for some of these players, and another about 8-9 iron into the green. Most of these players probably hitting a 9 iron or a pitching wedge even, and what should be a birdie look, but you got to hit the fairway. It's just a recurring theme here. Don't want to sound like a broken record, but that's really what you've got to do around this track. Hole 15 is 155 yards, short par 3, the last par 3 on property. Should be an easy hole as long as the wind's not coming off that coastline. Hole 16 is 513, so this is by far the most difficult hole on property. You do have to take it a little bit over a penalty area to get it in the fairway here, and the shot into the green isn't much easier, right? It's right around 200 yards. A lot of players will miss the fairway to the left, just bailing out from carrying it over that. I mean, if you slice it off the tee, you're in the center of this jungle, and you're dropping way, way back on here, laying up, and then you're looking at 6 at the very best. And then you'll see a few players miss it out to the left, actually into that jungle on the left side. And there's a little bit of a canal right here as well. Natural area where you have to take a drop. Just it's no fun. You don't want to end up in the jungle over there, or even worse, slicing it into the jungle on the right and having to really lay up. I mean, if you hit it in the stuff on the left, this is why players like straight to this side, you still take a drop and go for the green, right? Like you're not going to be as screwed. You're still behind the 8 ball. You're still looking at like bogey at best. But what you really have to avoid, and you've seen a few players on Sunday do this, is slicing it into the stuff on the right there. It's just, it's a double bogey, triple bogey waiting to happen. Hole 17 is 386 yards, a short par 4, another, pitch and putt, a little 100-yard, maybe 110-yard wedge shot into this green, and you're looking at a birdie look. So you can make up for what you do at hole 16 if you mess up. But you don't want to put yourself behind the 8 ball there. And hole 18 is 464. Difficult tee shot because of the bunkering. Also, relatively narrow landing area to boot. Now that we've seen the course hole by hole, let's talk about our key stats for analysis, what we're using to identify our top plays of the week. At number 1, we've got shots gained approach, which shouldn't surprise anybody. It's going to be a darts fest out there, and it is by far the most correlated stat week to week. But what's important to hone on here, and kind of what we talk about every week, are the buckets that we should maybe hone in on. So first off, the 125 to 150 range, you saw a ton of shots in the hole by hole breakdown coming from that distance, 150 to 175, and even that 50 to 125 yard range, with so many par 4s being under 400 yards. And even though players are laying up off the tee, you still saw a ton of shots from like 80, 60, even just like 105 yards, that sort of distance. So making sure we can find the best players with their numbered degrees wedges might be something to keep an eye on. Next up, we've got driving accuracy, which you might even argue should be number 1 here, but just given how correlated shots gained approach is week in and week out on tour, it's pretty much always going to be number 1. But driving accuracy, definitely looking at it. I mean, distance off the tee is going to be helpful, but when we're looking at off the tee numbers, accuracy is going to be the name of the game. A lot of players laying up here, a lot of players that, could take themselves out of the golf tournament with a few arrive shots. I mean, hole 16 was one of the notable ones because of how deep in trouble you can get with hitting that slice shot. But pretty much on any hole, right? If you hit a duck hook, if you end up slicing it into the stuff, you could be looking at double, triple bogey real quickly. It's no surprise that Brendan Todd has had a ton of success here. Even when he's not winning, he's finishing in the top 5, top 10. Victor Hovland, one of the better ball strikers, period, we've ever seen, probably ever on the PGA Tour. Not really a surprise that he's found some success here over the years. So that's a key stat we're definitely looking at. And then off the tee distance, it's not all that important, but it's helpful, right? So it's going to be in our modeling, but a lot more emphasis on the accuracy over the distance component. And then lastly, we're looking at birdie or better percentage too. It's a relatively easy golf course. You've had scores of 23 under, 20, and I believe 22 under par win it the last 4 years. So you're going to have to take it deep to win this thing. So I think you'd be remiss not to look at that as a key stat, whether you're looking at an outright or even a fantasy department, but especially so in the fantasy department, right? As your fantasy score is highly correlated to the amount of birdies, the amount of eagles that you're making any given week. So not looking at birdie or better percentage would be doing yourself a disservice, especially if you're in that market. But let alone if you're in the outright market, where to win this, you got to take it to 20 to 25 under par too. Few other stats to kind of touch on here is putting's a little bit less important this week. You got these large, easy to hit greens that also don't have that much undulation, only running at 10s on the stint meter. So I'm weighing it a little bit less, but even more so, we don't have a ton of Paspalum stats. The only measured rounds that we have on Paspalum over the last 3 years are at the PGA Championship. So, using a 2 or a 4 round sample size is probably unfair to most of the players in the field. So I'm looking at it a little bit less there too, as I don't think we can have as much confidence on this surface. Around the greens, almost non-existent this week because of the Paspalum grass. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it tends to be one of the easier surfaces to spin the ball on. And then distance, kind of touched on that too a little bit. Also not quite as important as most weeks. You're looking at more of a accuracy first sort of off the tee course, and then a lot of players laying up off the tee, hitting it to the same spot, hitting iron shots from the same distance. And while the longer players might be hitting a pitching wedge into the green, as somebody like a Brendan Todd is hitting a 9 or an 8 iron, it's not making that much of a difference, right? Typically, right, if they're hitting their full driver and Brendan Todd's hitting his driver 20, 30 yards less distance than those other players, then rather than a 1 to 2 club difference, it's a 3 to 4 club difference, right? So I know a lot of people try to dispel that myth by saying, oh, well, distance still matters for the second shot. It's not nearly as big a factor though, right? And I think if you're dismissing that, then I just don't think that you're running the right type of analysis. So those are a few of the key stats I'm looking at. Also looking at a few comp courses, which we'll touch on right now. So 3 main comp courses that I'm looking at this week, but also 3 extra ones that we'll touch on because of Paspalum grass. But first off, we got Waialae Country Club, which is a Bermuda course from tee to green. So you're not looking at an agronomy similarity, but it's a short par 70 coastal track, right? Hawaii tropical-like conditions like what we get here at Mayakoba. The real X factor is the test off the tee. Extremely narrow fairways, rough that's penal around that golf course. So you got to hit the fairways there. A little bit of a different test here, right? The rough's actually pretty much non-existent around Mayakoba, but you have those natural areas, right? So it's pretty much the same sort of thing. You got to keep it in play to be a top-end player. Approach play is also a key stat that we favor a lot around Waialae Country Club. So I think there's a lot of similarities there. Also, we get shots gained metrics, and it's been on tour for God knows how long at this point. So we get a huge sample size to work with. Next up, we've got Sedgefield Country Club, the home of the Wyndham Championship. So it's a par 71, just like this week. So unlike a par 70, like Waialae, and also super tight fairways. You've got to hit it to the right part of the fairway at Wyndham to set up angles into the greens. You have all those overhanging limbs, trees that are actually overhanging the fairway. So even when you're hitting fairways around the Wyndham, it's about what part of the fairway that you're getting to. So it's just the players that have had a lot of success at Sedgefield, kind of like a Brendan Todd, who's also had success at Waialae Country Club, has actually won there before. So not a surprise that Waialae would be on the list, of course, is another course that we have to look at. Port Royal Golf Course, what we saw last week, is another course I'm using as a comp. It's a short tropical. You got the windy conditions going on. It's Bermuda, just like Waialae. Sedgefield's also Bermuda from tee to green. So you're not looking at an agronomy standpoint here, but just from the skill set, you need accuracy off the tee. You got to be solid with the irons. And though Port Royal is a little bit more of a putting test, we saw it last week. So when we're looking at these comp courses, these shots gained metrics, they're the most fresh that they can possibly be. So if the course that we played last week has anything similar to what we're going to see this week, there's a really good chance of using it as a comp course just because of that recency, right? How fresh that data is. So I'm definitely looking at Port Royal for the Bermuda Championship too. But the last 3 I'm looking at, which I don't have listed on the visual here, but are 3 agronomy similarities. So it's Corrales Golf Club, the home of the Corrales Punta Cana Championship. That's over there in Dominican Republic, has Paspalum from tee to green. Cocoa Beach Golf Club, the home of the Puerto Rico Open, an event that I believe was discontinued as of last year. Maybe it's still going on. I'm not sure with Puerto Rico Open. It's a really small alternate field event at this point, but first win for Tony Finau and a Victor Hovland came here. Paspalum from tee to green, 2 players that are in this field, so definitely a comp I'm looking at. And then Vedanta Vallarta. Of course, we had a bunch of Paspalum down in Mexico last year. Now, Corrales, another long course, so that's the one thing I have to say, right? It's similar from the agronomy standpoint, from the tropical standpoint, but it's a long golf course. Cocoa Beach, also not that short. And Vedanta Vallarta was like 7,600 yards, and also massive fairways. They weren't hard to hit at all. So from the course fit standpoint, that's why I don't have them up on the visual. They don't really check that box at all. But if you're looking for Paspalum players, guys that have had success at this sort of track, then you would be pretty well served looking at those 3 as well. That is all I've got for this week's course breakdown. Before you hop on out of here, go ahead and comment what you think the winning score is going to be. I'm personally going to take 21 under par, but would love to hear your thoughts down below. And also, go ahead and smash that like button. We will have a full slate of content dropping. DFS core picks dropping later on this afternoon, a DFS live stream Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time, and some NFL content to boot. So if you enjoyed what you're seeing here, you want to make sure you catch all of my fantasy content to come. Make sure you are also subscribed to the channel so you don't miss anything when it drops. But until then, guys, best of luck with any outrights or any DFS lineups that you decide to enter this week. If you're just watching this to get an idea for the course, you're a PGA Tour fan, hopefully you can enjoy. I expect there to be a little bit more TV coverage this week. It's a better field. You've got Scotty Scheffler out there, right? Victor Hovland, guys like Tony Finau out there. Should be a competitive, interesting, and hopefully a profitable week for us on the fantasy side too. So looking forward to it, guys. Best of luck, and I'll catch you guys next week.